P&R with Adam R. Welcome to 3 P&R. My guest this evening is the True Crime panel again. We're going to start with Leslie Ghiglieri and move our way right. Everyone introduce yourselves.
I'm Leslie Ghiglieri, and I'm a true crime author. I have a background in law enforcement, working on the dispatch 911 side, as well as working in computer services for law enforcement agencies.
Jason?
My name's Jason White. I'm a homicide detective in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I've been a police officer for 25 years. I've worked as a homicide detective for the last 14 years. I've been involved in approximately 600 to 700 homicides, and I was a crisis negotiator for about 10 and a half years as well. So I've been around. I've done a lot of different assignments, and glad to be here.
I'm Sandra Martinez. I am a psychologist, forensic psychologist, and I've worked in corrections for the past 18 years. And actually, just like Jason, I too was a crisis negotiator for the Department of Corrections in Florida for about 10 years as well.
Excellent. The topic of this episode is the Memphis Three. These are three young boys at the time. This is the early 90s, actually. Jesse and Miss Kelly, Jason Baldwin, Damian Eccles. The three of these men were incarcerated for the homicide of three 8-year-old little boys, which in hindsight looked like a witch hunt just to solve a crime. Bearing in mind in the 90s, if you wore black apparently and you had black hair and you listened to Metallica or other metal bands, you were guilty of Satanism. So it was a bizarre case. We'll start off, Leslie, your thoughts.
Well, I think this is another case, unfortunately, as we mentioned pre-podcast a little bit there, where law enforcement neglected to do thorough investigation. And I think it ended up with these three young men being falsely imprisoned. I think there's a number of things that point to that, as we've seen with high-profile cases, because this case did not have a celebrity, but instead had victims that were of a very young age. It was a heinous crime, and there always seems to be a tendency to maybe jump to an arrest and a conviction just because it's a high-profile case. And I think because of that, these boys were not given the type of investigation to the case that could have been done that I think would have resulted in a different outcome.
Jason, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'm going to echo some of the things that she said. I think that this is easily one of those type of cases that, number one, you have the ingredients for really what happened here when you have a department that unfortunately is just not well equipped to work in a type of case like this, high profile. They were way beyond their level of expertise with respect to this type of incident. They actually kind of put a roadblock up with respect to asking other agencies like Arkansas State Police and maybe even the FBI with respect to this type of a case to come in and lend their expertise. So when you have that, and then also one of the things that really jumps to mind with respect to this type of case is a grid reminder that, you know, I think that our criminal justice system isn't necessarily one of the best in the world. I know we oftentimes hear that, oh my gosh, we've just got the best criminal justice system in the world, etc. When in fact, I think that there's a lot of work to be done. And in this case also, I think that the level of frustration for me personally, and I know we're going to dive into this a lot deeper, but that's how difficult it is for somebody to be able to present really valid evidence in support of their innocence. And, I think we're really lucky specifically that Damian Eccles did not get executed, actually. That could have very easily happened. And I'm actually pro death penalty, but, we're just really fortunate that in this particular case that he didn't fall victim to being killed. And I'm pretty sure that they're the three of these guys. I have no doubt in my mind that they're all three innocent. But That's my take on it in a very, very short synopsis.
Sandy, what do you think?
I'm going to echo some of the things that Leslie and Jason did as well. I think it's another case where it's a smaller town, like Jason said, where they're not really equipped for this. And there's that pressure, a huge amount of pressure to find, a guilty party in this. And I think they went with something, people that, they fit that profile. So they kind of forced them into that profile just so that they could please, the community. They wanted a response. They wanted it then and, immediately. And I think, again, they kind of put blinders on and really didn't broaden, their search or anything like that. So it's kind of like, oh, this was easy mark. And they just went with it.
So credit is due where credit is due. HBO wanted to do the documentary on this case after the case was established. What we didn't see is, and I did a lot of background into it, the news reports leading to the arrest of these boys. They were desperate to apprehend someone. There was a tremendous amount of pressure on this community to find who did this. The occult was kind of on the radar of law enforcement at the time. Satanism was on their radar. Damien Echols, he's peculiar behavior to him. He, all black, the fingernails, it's you're stereotyping. And so I don't think HBO expected this to turn into what it did. I think they were just going to monitor the case, record the trial. Somewhere in the middle of this creating of this documentary is where I think the producers of HBO recognized that these are innocent boys. And that's where that's how that got kicked off. So credits to HBO. HBO saved Damien Echols' life. Legitimately. HBO gave light to this case, which we would probably never hear about. These boys would probably still be in jail because, let's be honest, when you're in the system, your voice is muffled. Letters don't matter, cry outs from family. If the media is not involved, which typically the media, they find a juicy case, they speak to it, they drop it. HBO did not let it go. Their documentary at that time, for what viral should be, is what today, but it went viral through communities then. I think the real tragedy is we don't have someone incarcerated for the death of these boys. That's the real tragedy. I would like to see some company revisit it. Maybe pick up a team with a Jason White on it and maybe dive back into it, right? Because it's still a cold case. There's so many things in this, like the behavior of some of the people in this program, right? Like, where do you start? Where do you start? Jason, let's start with this. I want to start with this. Sandy, the mental capacity of this kid, Jesse Miss Kelly, there is no, this really kind of, it echoes what we saw at Brandon Darcy. Low IQ, probably coerced under a tremendous amount of pressure to say a false statement. What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah. So imagine, it was so well known around that community, everything going on, and there is pressure. And I do believe that they're very impressionable. So if they're kind of led a certain way and they think, okay, if I appease the police, I do what I'm supposed to do, right? And I'm just going to follow their lead and I give them what they want, that things will be better for me. That can be the case with lower IQ. So it's kind of hard because you may have low IQ, but yet have an ability to adapt very well. So you can have very good street sense. But it doesn't seem like he did. And so his ability to maybe adapt and really see the consequences of what he was saying, as he went along with the police during that time, it landed him in a tough spot, just like, Brendan Dassey, where they think, okay, I'm done. So then there's no consequence. That means I get to go. And I think that's where he was probably lacking. I mean, it's kind of hard to tell from that because out of all of them, he was probably highlighted the least. And you kind of didn't really get a really good sense for him as far as his, capabilities of adapting and, and actually like being able to kind of like care for himself and things like that and make those decisions. But it definitely comes into play.
Yeah. I mean, the body language of him in court shows someone who's submissive psychologically. It's, and I don't want to, sound like an ass when I say this, but when you have an animal and they're wrong, they almost in the same sense, they cower, their head are between their legs. He didn't want to face a jury. He didn't want to testify against the other two guys because he didn't want to face them. I mean, he had this, you're talking about a guy who's a teenager, late teenager, who's behaving like a 5-year-old when they're in trouble. And I think this again, it's another case of someone with diminished capacity who's being utilized to get an arrest. Even when I hear about he witnessed the boys punching these children with their hands, I think one of the things they should have taken note of is, were there any offensive or defensive marks on either of the two people arrested? Their hands were unblemished. It's the first thing I think about when I hear the details of this case is, why were these two boys, Damien and Jason, not marked up on their hands? How the lack of evidence, the lack of blood. Later on in the episode, you hear that they found the testicles of this kid, one of the children, in Damien's house, but that was never revisited. That was brought up one time, and through all 3 documentaries, it was never revisited. So it was complete horseshit. I'm not sure why I didn't get touched on again. Like, even Damien asked, well, how did that get in my room? Never heard another word about it. So it was honestly nonsense. Jason, you get this case. You hear about these 3 boys, and then you find out you have suspects. And, you don't see any kind of marks on their body or hands indicating that they savagely beat anyone or committed these crimes. How do you take this case?
Well, first off, for your listeners, we're referring to the case that is the documentary that's highlighted on HBO, and it's called Paradise Lost. It's three different episodes, and it's going to be in reference to the deaths of 3 second-grade children. Their names are Chris Byers, Stephen Branch, and Michael Moore. And like I said, they were second graders who were literally found in the in nearby. They lived in the Robin Hood Hills area of West Memphis, Arkansas, which is just across the Mississippi River from Memphis, Tennessee. And the area that they found these young boys, they'd came up missing. One of the step parents of one of the 3 boys had called the police to report that the 3 were missing, and basically, ultimately, they ended up finding the 3 located in kind of a really wooded area, swampy looking, actually, with kind of like a lot of water. There's like a waterway that goes through there, and just really kind of a place that kids would go. Really, I mean, kids their age, I'm not surprised that they would. It doesn't surprise me that they would be familiar. As a kid myself, when I was a kid, I would have probably explored that area like crazy. So, but anyway, for like your casual adult, I don't think that your normal adult is going to be in areas like that. So, let's say I get this case. The first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to identify the victims. That's going to be paramount in this particular case. And we want to be sure as to who the victims are. That's going to be through, who's missing in the area. Now, of course, we've got one parent. We know of the one parent. So it's likely going to be one of those kids. But you want to be absolutely sure, and you want to make sure that you're able to start the identification process. That's going to be number one. You're going to also want to make sure that this particular crime scene is really cordoned off. And I know that one of the things that's heavily criticized in this particular case is the fact that there is a lot of crime scene concerns where they had a number of different officers and just people that were basically walking through the area. They were heavily criticized in reference to not calling the medical examiner investigators or the medical examiner's office. Actually, I think it's a coroner system there in Arkansas, but they're heavily criticized for not calling the coroner for a couple of hours. I'll put that to rest real quick, because usually just for homicide detectives, we don't generally call the medical examiner's office for quite some time. Actually, that's normal protocol. But I think where they do deserve a little bit of criticism with respect to this is the fact that they actually moved the bodies from their locations, where in some instances they were submerged or partially submerged, and they moved the bodies to a different spot, and that was without the direction of the coroner's office. And you can't do that. Those bodies are under the jurisdiction of the medical examiner's office. I would say that to armchair quarterback this and to go backwards and how this probably should have been handled, I think that you would have figured out a way to lower the water level to where you could actually be able to access the bodies a lot easier, and that way maybe you could ensure that you wouldn't lose any types of evidence or something like that. So that's going to be one of the things. Now, your question is, what about the bodies themselves? I mean, of course, you're going to be looking for what type of injuries are, you have 3 second graders, so it's clearly foul play of some sort or some massive tragic accident. And in this case, clearly it wasn't a tragic accident. It was these children were bound and they were naked. And so, and one of the reports is that there was some evidence that maybe the testicles had partially been removed, or there was some evidence that the penis may have been partially removed, etc. And that has later since been debunked, or at least they came up with a pretty valid argument that it was probably more like turtles or something along that nature, or animal activity that caused that type of an injury. But that's what I would do, and I think that the other thing that I would do is you're going to start immediately. It's going to be an all hands on deck kind of a situation. I mean, you got 3 dead children. That's you're going to dedicate. Price is no object. You're going to dedicate everybody. It's however many people you can get in there to start doing canvasses in the neighborhood, the nearby area. This area is literally right across from a semi truck car wash, as well as probably one of the busier truck stops in the country, right off of I-40, or at least in that area. So, the suspect pool at this point is going to be significant. And, that's what I'd be concentrating my efforts on. And I'd start talking to the parents. I mean, you're going to start talking to the people that are absolutely the closest, or the people that found him. And then you're going to kind of go out from there. And that's another area that they really kind of dropped the ball in this case, is they focused their canvas in a certain part of the neighborhood, but they didn't really focus it over in the area where, we'll get more into this, but where one of the boys lived, and his dad or his stepfather is actually a really shining star suspect in this case. Really,
yeah. But the way this film played out chronologically. So let's start with the early news reports before they apprehended the 3 boys. You already heard satanic ritual being spread amongst the community, and there, it's the Bible Belt. I understand why. Prior to the arrest of these boys, and prior to them even canvassing adequately and expanding on that, it's already they had an expert of the occult in the area before he even saw a courtroom. Before he was even, they communicated with this gentleman 2 weeks prior to this murder happening. So there was already concern for a cult. So they're not looking at this clean, right? They're automatically assuming that there's cult-like activity. The way it was edited, you have Pam Hobbs on, in the documentary anyhow. I found it peculiar. Now, what they didn't tell you is when she was on camera and she had the boys' scarf for Cub Scouts, she did not. They were not aware the boys were dead yet. He was missing at that point, because she kind of laughed like, "Oh, I'm going to be on TV, ha ha ha," and then she got serious and spoke about it. To be very clear with people when they watch the documentary, nobody was aware of the death of these boys yet. They're just missing at this point. Because even when I saw it, I was like, "Is she really laughing about being on TV?" But then when you realize in chronological order the time placement of that, there was no death there. Even more so, the bigger problem, just as you said, they really did not expand on their canvassing. They didn't really speak to a lot of people. It wasn't till this boy, and you know what they never expressed in the documentary, nor did they say later on at all, for that matter. I'm going to look deeper into it, is how it came to be that they got Jesse Misskelley. How did this guy get picked up in the first place? No one brings that up. I didn't hear it through the documentary, and if they did say it, I missed it. At what point did this guy come forward, or why? That's a bizarre part of the case. He's really the instrument, the main tool that incarcerated these guys for life terms and wanted them to be put to death. That creeps me out. The other thing, Jason, in that crime scene, it was alleged in the documentary that where the bodies were found, it was a dump site, not the initial area of where they were murdered. That was not revisited anywhere through this documentary in the later episodes. Did they confirm was that a dump area, or were they murdered there? If so, the lack of blood is concerning. These kids were brutalized. But then again, like you said, later on they find out animals really contributed to the disfigurement of their face and their genitals, or the one boy's genitals. A knife expert later on, years later, I think it was like 2011, where they figure out it was the marks were not that of a knife, serrated or otherwise. So the whole case for me is bizarre. So Leslie, I'll ask you from the perspective of a true crime writer and a fan of true crime. What were some flags for you through this whole thing? Leslie, you got me?
Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Yep.
Okay, sorry. I would like to talk about the interview with Jesse a little bit more. And what struck me, first of all, this is just a speculation on my part. If they had their eyes on Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin, maybe Jesse Misskelley was also a little part of that group. And because they saw him as the most vulnerable of the three, they set out their sights to interrogate him first off, thinking they might have a better chance at getting to the truth or getting a confession. I remember hearing the numbers that he had been interviewed for 12 hours, and he did not have a representative at all, no parent and no lawyer. And as Sandy said, he was of a lower IQ. But here you have a kid, even if he's average IQ and he's interviewed for that period of time, they taped 42 minutes of that interview, but the rest of the time they were just kind of hammering him. It sounded very much to me like they were leading him on, coercing him, even mentioning, that there's a reward right now for anybody that has information that leads to an arrest. And wouldn't it be nice if you could buy your dad a new pickup truck with that $30,000, or words to generally that effect? So they were definitely saw Jesse as someone who was easier to manipulate and maybe would confess and say what they wanted him to say. And they were definitely leading him with the kinds of answers that they wanted. And I found that very disturbing, the fact he had no representation, no one there to be sure that it didn't get out of hand or that he wasn't taken advantage of. And then you take his confession and the degree of how it affected the outcome of this case as a whole. They took his confession basically as what convicted the other two boys. And when you consider how the confession was handled and the limitations, it just seems to me at least he says later on, and even after they were finally released, that he said it just because he was led down that road. And a lot of his answers didn't even make sense about what he says he saw the other boys doing to the victims. And and then it seems like the detective sort of led him along to give them the more answer that they wanted to hear, the special words that they were looking to have him say in order to say, oh, yes, you saw this. And they were just leading him with his answers. So I just found that very upsetting, very disturbing.
Well, it's very reminiscent of Brendan Darcy. Same situation, no representation. He's a minor at the time. Even more so. No, I don't want to say this. I don't want to be insensitive when I say this. Sandy, you have a criminal in your system. You have to, interact with. Just so people are aware, this guy, Jesse, his IQ score was between 71 and 72. And forgive me for saying, but to be considered mildly retarded in the system of America, it's typically an IQ score of 69. This guy's not far off. And I'm not saying this to be mean toward him. I'm not saying this for any other reason other than to say that and this was known through that town. People knew this of him. I looked through a lot of different information on this. It was very widely known that he was slower. So when you have an individual who's scoring a 72 IQ, about 3 marks away from being considered a special needs individual, it should just not only be that there's better representation and or parents there, but a specialist should be on hand, right? Sandy, if you're dealing with someone in prison and they're asking you to interact with them, what is the protocol for that?
So even if they have low IQ, and there are plenty of individuals actually in the correctional system that have lower IQ, whether it's borderline, mild, moderate, we do interact with them. Like I was saying earlier, you can have a low IQ, but to really kind of define whether that really comes into play, you really have to kind of assess them and see if they're able to adapt and to their environment. I've met plenty of criminals that they may have lower IQs, just like Jesse did. However, they make it up in their street sense, meaning they're very capable of adapting and manipulating the system and knowing their system very well.
Right.
In Jesse's case, that's what I was saying is I don't think he's lived that life. You know what I mean? Where, he has that second type of education, let's say, you know what I mean?
Right.
So here comes the police, coming to ask questions and everything. This is, uncharted waters for him. So imagine, he is a little slower. So maybe when they ask him questions, he's probably not fully understanding, and so he's looking at maybe sometimes guidance, and it happens with them. You can see it where they don't want to come across as not knowing or being less intelligent than anybody else. So a lot of times they try to fake the funk and say, okay, yeah, like they go along with it thinking that, they really don't understand what's being asked of them. So they kind of go along. They're like, yeah, you know what I mean? They answer, yeah, but it's not because they really understand what's being asked of them, but it's them also trying to cover up.
Right. I agree with you there.
For their lack of intelligence.
I agree because through the interview, they started when they asked him about, when did you see the boys? When did this happen? It started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and then it was noon. And then you could, through the tapes and the affidavits, you could see how they were trying to arrive at 8 p.m. And it's despicable the way they did it. It was almost like they were like saying, oh, we just want to be sure of this. I mean, you did say this, but we wanted to be sure of it. Like they were assuring him that he was saying the right thing, even though they were manipulating the time frame. And that was disturbing to me. Jason, you have a case you're working on, involving a homicide. The individual you're working with has a very diminished capacity. Let's hypothetically say you're in a small town. Who this guy is by, hearsay, and you also know that he's, a very low IQ, considerably low, where, in my opinion, would have to be in a special needs classroom, Jay. So how do you handle that, Jay?
Well, I mean, I think we're talking specifically about Mr. and Miss Kelly Jr. I mean, because the other two, in my opinion, aren't quite. Damien Eccles, in my opinion, is not quite as diminished as he's been advertised. I think a lot of that came from the death penalty, psychologists, et cetera, that were involved in that case that kind of painted him like he was a walking moron or something. And I didn't get that at all. Damien Eccles is an intelligent young man, even though he dropped out. That's my opinion. And as far as Jason Baldwin goes, he's exceptionally bright too. He was a very bright student. And so forth. But when you take Mr. and Miss Kelly Jr. into play here, I think that what happened on the early stages of this case is that, they started looking at who are the troublemakers in the area. And that's where you started rounding up, the ones that seem to have their name pop up often. And they didn't really have anything to work with. I mean, straight out of the gate, they didn't. There's not any smoking gun at the scene of this deal. I'm not surprised that there's not a lot of blood. And I've probably said this in another one of your podcasts and stuff, is because if you're dead and you die relatively quickly, first of all, look at the type of death that we're talking about here. I mean, we're talking about, I think if I remember correctly, there's a blunt force to the head or something along those lines. And when you're dealing with that, if you die quickly, you're not going to bleed. I mean, if your heart isn't beating, you ain't bleeding. And so then you have to ask, well, why did these two other children, how come they didn't run off? And because there's something that happens sometimes on these type of cases, and people freeze. They just kind of freeze in place. And I would think that in this particular case, the other two boys, one of them got attacked, and then you have the other two boys that probably just stood there and didn't know what to do, and they probably had a moment there where I don't know if they thought that really this was kind of, maybe they were probably terrified, if truth be known. And so if I have a guy that's got diminished, to answer your question, I kind of went off to kind of set the stage. To answer your question about somebody having a diminished level of intelligence, I mean, we deal with that all the time. We want to know, do they know that we're the police? The standard is not very high. They have to know that we're the cops. They need to know that they're at a police station, where he's located, maybe simple questions. And if the detectives are asking him just simple questions to make sure that he can answer appropriately, that's really the standard that's necessary. We can talk to people that are drunk or high, and we can talk to people that have mental illness, and we can talk to people that have diminished levels of intelligence. And we certainly don't give them a test as to what their IQ is before we start speaking to them. I just got asked this on the stand just recently, where I had a guy that was clearly he just came out of the hospital, and he had killed his wife or his girlfriend, and he came out of the hospital, and he was I'm sure he was under some sort of pain medication or whatever, but he was, why didn't you give him a field sobriety test before you talk to him? We don't do that either. I mean, I base my thing on, how does this guy talk to me, and whether or not he's able to speak. Yeah, so that's what I would be doing. But we have a responsibility. We as the police have a responsibility to make sure that they do understand everything, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that people can, especially when they're being interviewed for great lengths of time, which 12 hours, you have to ask yourself, is that reasonable? Because that's really the standard. It's what is reasonable, right? What is in a reasonable amount of time, and sometimes 12 hours might be reasonable. It depends upon the circumstances of the case. I mean, every case is different. I think that in the case where you have 3 dead children, and for whatever reason led them to him, it may be reasonable. I will say something real quick before you move on to the next guest, and that's, I would have probably told you before I was a homicide detective, I would have probably been very, very skeptical of somebody sitting there and telling you that they were involved in this type of a crime. And because, and even not only stopping there, but going on further and saying that one of these guys actually sexually molested one of these children, and that he even participated by chasing after one of them and holding him down for the others. I would have been skeptical of that, but I was actually involved in a case that we had a quadruple murder once, and we had a witness that we started hearing about. And in that particular case, once we found her, I mean, she gave a vivid account of these murders that took place. that was like you were there. I mean, I literally was traumatized as I'm listening to this story, and she was very, very detailed in how these murders took place. And really, a lot of what she was saying was actually accurate compared to the evidence that was at the scene. And it turns out, in retrospect, I got to give credit to the guy that I was interviewing her with. I was actually the backing interviewer. I wasn't the main guy. And I walked out of there and I was like, holy cow, this is crazy, the detail. And he, to his credit, he was like, man, I don't believe her. And I was like, are you nuts? This lady, I'm going to need counseling after listening to this story. I mean, she was super detailed, and it turned out she was lying. And so, you know, it can happen. I thank heavens I've only seen 2 cases in the 14 years that I've been in homicide where we've had a false confession, and one of them is the one that I just described, and the other one was I wasn't involved in directly. I just know of it. So it can happen, and you know, the persuasion that police, I mean, it can happen. The cops, they're trying to figure out what happened to these young kids. I don't think that there was any intent for them to just go ahead and railroad somebody just to get this case solved. I absolutely don't feel that at all in this particular case. The main investigator that you see a lot on that documentary, I actually liked the guy. He seemed like he was genuinely upset and he wanted to do the right thing. And I think that he actually came to a point where he believed that these kids were involved. But you know, it's a very, very complicated situation. It's one of those things where if you just, and I'll tell you right now, if I had a case like this tomorrow, I would be leaning on those that were far more experienced than myself to help out. You know, I wouldn't be pushing them away. I'd want people there to help me along. And I think that was probably one of their first mistakes, is they were in a rush to judgment. And you had a lot of that external pressure, and not only external pressure, but internal pressure from within their own police department to get these people off of the streets. And when that happens, and then when you take the media into play too, then and all that pressure that comes with the media, you have a potential of making mistakes, and that's something that we can never afford to do on these type of cases. You just can't, and that's why we're here today. We don't talk about the cases that were just great investigations. Nobody wants to talk about that.
Right.
They want to talk about those that are plagued with problems, and this one is no exception.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is just my opinion, or at least my perspective. If there's a minor, this guy's 17 when they're interviewing him, 12 hours, a minor. If I'm this guy's parents, I'm already concerned. What are they talking about? Why are they holding him for 12 hours? Secondly, I think I would be smart enough to pick up that his mental capacity is not, it's not baseline with the people surrounding me. And if I want to solve a case legitimately and get the right people, for me anyway, I would have a second set of ears. I would have a professional in there right away to have this guy evaluated. Is this guy capable of, 1, telling the truth, 2, does he comprehend what's going on? Because back then, like you said, a lot of pressure to make an arrest in a small community in the Bible Belt. A lot of shit went wrong, man. It's disturbed. Like when I was watching this documentary and hearing this guy speak, I was immediately thinking of Brendan Darcy. I mean, immediately. I was shocked. And it's like, it seems to be that these are the guys that they will push the hardest to secure the arrest. And that and I'm finding even more so in non-metropolitan areas. Right, small communities, small departments. It's a scary thought. And then you have these other polarizing characters like this guy, this Mark Beyer. That guy was, I had to wonder.
He's entertaining.
I had to wonder, like, did HBO plant this guy? Because like there's no way this is a real person, right? But sure as shit, he is. He's just beyond bizarre. He is, and I got to tell you, I think HBO did this intentionally. The way they put this film together, I immediately had him as a suspect. Mm-hmm. I mean, immediately. In fact, throughout the entire first documentary, he's one of the few people, one of the primaries that were on my mind. I mean, let's talk in terms of early documentary. Leslie, start with you. Who is your suspect early documentary?
Oh, I think Mark Beyer was definitely there, but also we can't forget about the patron that came into the Bojangles restaurant. And man, it seems like it's almost an afterthought, and maybe there was more investigation that went on in that regard, but that's who I thought right off. And the fact that the patrol woman that came out didn't even okay, so just for anybody that doesn't know about the case, on the very night that the boys had gone missing, there was a man who came into a Bojangles restaurant, and he had blood on his arms and he had mud on his pant legs, and he went into the restroom there, and the woman's restroom, and sequestered himself in there for a while. We don't really know how long, but then the manager of the Bojangles called the police. I don't know how long it was before the officer got there, but when she got there, she didn't get out of her car. She found out that he had left the restaurant prior to her getting there and basically went about her way. I mean, it sounded like without much of a thought, or without broadcasting that information, or without getting more of a description. Maybe there was more to it than it seemed, but it was pretty minimal. And it wasn't until the following day, if I recall, that the detectives came out and did a forensic look at the bathroom and took some scrapings of blood. And when asked later on during the course of the trial about the scrapings that had been taken, they'd been lost. So that has always kind of bothered me. Just with the blood and the mud, like the boys were found in the creek. It just seemed like a very suspicious incident. And I don't know if there was more follow-up. But definitely I thought of him, Mark Byers, and I do think that we're always told, and Jason, of course, I think he would agree, don't they say with a murder victim that you always look at the people closest to them first? And it didn't seem like the police really did that. Because later in the documentary, a father of one of the other boys was considered suspect because some of his DNA was found in one of the ligatures, or very close to his DNA. It didn't seem like he was ever really investigated at the time of the crime. And we always hear it's usually someone that knows you. I mean, not always, we know that too, but at least the information that they gave on the documentary didn't seem like they spent a lot of time investigating the parents. And of course, it's horrific. You don't want to think that the parents would be involved, but that's something that seems is pretty standard. This Mark Byers was a little bit of a fruitcake. And if I'm not mistaken about him too, they say that he had a brain tumor later on, that he had surgery. So maybe that accounted for part of the way he was acting out.
Yeah, his behavior was exceptional.
Yeah.
And the guy you're referring to, they call him Mr. Bojangles. They don't have a name for this guy. It would appear that he went in there looking super suspect and just disappeared. And frankly speaking, the timeline for when this guy was spotted, the way he looked, that's another big question mark. It's within the timeline. You're right. I'm reading here, mud, blood, very suspicious behavior, basically forced his way into a restroom. Law enforcement was contacted, but then he's gone. He just disappears into the shadows. And this article here from 2009, they're still looking for him. He's still a person of interest for what I'm reading here, for more than one thing. He's a person of interest for more than one thing. That case specifically. Mark Byers. Oh, man. So, he passed a polygraph. I've read psychopaths have pulled this off in the past multiple times. So, no surprise there. They find what they thought were teeth marks in one of the boys' heads. Later on, I believe they determined it to be something with animals. But however, the way the series was put together, he had his teeth. He told one person his teeth were knocked out because of a confrontation. He told another person he had some sort of gum disease. His teeth fell out. And then another person, he had them surgically removed for some other oddball reason. And he kind of flaunted that on camera, as is to say, well, you're not going to get me. They painted this guy intentionally on the show as a suspect. Sandy, what do you think? Who was your suspect early podcast? Or I'm sorry, early episodes?
I'm actually going to pretty much echo exactly what Leslie said. I'm not going to be that original. Yeah, Mark Byers does definitely. Yeah, he is a little off, and the thing is, he was also the adopted father, so he doesn't have a biological tie to him. So for me, I'm like, oh, okay, so if you were going to do it, this isn't your personal child. I mean, and so I'm just like, huh. And definitely the suspect for me definitely is in Bojangles. I just think it's a small town that doesn't happen probably very often, and the likelihood of that happens the same exact night that the three boys go missing. For me, that's a pretty large coincidence, especially for a small town like that. And I wouldn't be surprised if the guy was transient, meaning not from there or anything like that. And it is such a shame that they misplaced or lost, the sample that they've gotten from the bathroom, because that would have maybe helped, in so many ways. And maybe this wouldn't have been an unsolved, crime at all. So it's missed out opportunity. I was really surprised that they would be kind of that careless, considering, at the time, all of the hype and attention that, that
right.
They would be like that. I don't know. I would think like I would want to cross my T's and dot my I's, but I know there's also pressure and tension, and there are mistakes. We've all made them, but I would think that was a pretty big one.
Yeah.
Unless they really felt like, no, they were already set on maybe Damon and the other boys. And so it was kind of like, you know what I mean? Like not really focusing on that.
Right. They were absolutely focused on those boys, 100%. And to surprise you guys, within the first, there's, the series of 3 documentaries. Within the first, Terry Hobbs stood out to me too. Because later on you find out, same scenario, really. Adopted father, the wife. So what I have a habit of doing this. When I watch documentaries, I fact check as I go. And there were a lot of reports of domestic abuse from him on both the mother and the boy. He was abusive towards other children in the neighborhood. And that guy got on my radar pretty early on. Obviously it wasn't until later on in the series where they started hyper-focusing on him because he decided to sue the Dixie Chicks, which was a bizarre move. But, Jason, for you, early documentary, did you have any key suspects?
Well, no, not really. Actually, based on the documentary and the early stages of it, I mean, of course, when you get fed the Miss Kelly interview that he said that that he held one of the boys or chased after one of the boys and held him down while one of the other two sexually molested one of the two. I mean, I'm sitting there listening to this going, all right, well, wow. All right. That's I'm just having a hard time believing that he's got such a creative imagination that he's just coming up with this stuff. So to me, he was one of the number ones. Mr. Byers, actually, he was pretty out there. And as a matter of fact, he spanked one of the boys earlier that day, or that he spanked his own stepchild that day. Right. I looked at him as, to tell you the truth, the more I watched that, he seemed to be incredible. First of all, he came across to me as being somewhat intelligent. I know that's kind of, at least based on the cast of characters that we're dealing with here, he seemed to be relatively intelligent. He put forth a lot of thought and almost honest to a fault. I mean, it didn't matter what it was when he was asked about certain things. He seemed to be super forthcoming about information. Yeah. And so he really didn't stand out to me, honestly. And I'm with you that Terry Hobbs actually, because of course I'm watching their behavior. When you have news footage of them when they're finding out about the deaths and so forth. And the thing that kind of stands out to me is when his wife collapses and he doesn't really have any emotion. Now I know that everybody deals with things differently. And I get the fact that this isn't, this is a stepchild, et cetera, but I didn't see any emotion from him really. And that kind of stood out to me from the early stages of just the clips that they were showing and stuff. I thought that was bizarre, but I'll tell you what, I really didn't know. And I maybe it's because of what I do. I try not to get too focused in on anybody in particular, because that can really get dangerous. Right. You want to keep an open mind. And so I was kind of keeping an open mind, but of course, me as a detective there at that specific deal if I was working in that area, I think that if I was starting to hear stuff about Miss Kelly's statement, immediately I'd be thinking that, all right, well then, this there's something going on here. That's what I would be thinking, actually. But that would be coming from somebody from the outside that wasn't sitting in on the interview as well. So
what about this guy, Mr.
I really don't know.
What do you think about this, the mystery guy, Mr. Bojingles? Same night the boys go missing, mud and blood on his.
Oh, I think it's I mean, for me. Yes. I mean, it's a huge screw up here. I mean, by the way, they actually found a hair that was on the sheet, one of the sheets that was around near one of the boys or something that belonged to a black male, I think is what they said, or a black individual. So that's yet another piece of circumstantial evidence. I think it's an incredible argument. And I think that certainly should have been played a little bit more. I thought that the defense attorneys, to tell you the truth, I thought they were really pretty good. Yeah. I was actually impressed with them from the clips that they showed in the trial. They seemed like they were really trying, but they were just hitting. They were up against the system.
Yeah.
But I thought that they were trying their best, and really, I would have hammered that a lot more. And I thought that the police officer that they put on the stand, that female, I thought she was terrible. She didn't even write a report in reference to even being called out there at all. She didn't think that. Oh, I didn't think it was important. And that's pretty big. So.
Well, before we dive into the miscarriage of the court proceeding itself, because I got to tell you, that was a miscarriage. Let's talk more about Terry Hobbs. You don't hear so the final documentary pretty ends on the note that he's a person of interest. There's some DNA things that lead him there. Where he was on the night of was now called in question due to a witness or witnesses, plural, who had seen him with those very boys around the time they go missing. The friend he was supposedly with, doesn't put him in the place where he says he was. Everything this guy is saying is a lie. On top of which, you hear about his background in domestic abuse. It's not the first time. They found an ex of his from years prior where the same thing played out. He's an abusive, violent man. And to Jason's credit, what he said, when you watch the guy in the first documentary and you see the wife talking, the one thing that grabbed my attention is that his eye movement. He was so disconnected. He was looking every other direction. No kind of emotional reinforcement to his wife when her child is now found dead. Just sitting pretty stoically with really no reaction. Whether or not he loved the boy or not, you would think that he loved his wife and would feel for her. And the crocodile tears, which the few times you saw him showing an emotion, I 100% think that was horseshit. And that's when you read the background and you're watching the first doc and you start, because I have this thing where I watch something, like I told you, I will fact check. I will look these people up. I'll look into them long before. So this way, I'm not looking at it the way HBO wants me to look at it. I want to look at it from every perspective. And yeah, Mark that guy's You know what? Maybe Jason's right, because some people that are super intelligent, they become loony. They can't handle that kind of IQ. And later on, that guy goes on to be a champion for the boys that he condemned. Like, he's just.
Well, I mean, there's something to be said with that too. By the way, though, is because and the thing that jumps out to me with respect to that is Hobbs. In his mind, those kids are the ones that did it. He's not interested in any other explanation. And because I think that, let's just hypothetically say that Hobbs did this. He wouldn't want there to be any other explanation.
Right.
He doesn't want people to, hypothetically, if he's the one that did this, he would not want anybody to be looking any further.
Right.
He wants this thing put to bed. Whereas you look at Mr. Byers, okay, you've shown me that these boys aren't guilty. Let's find out who did this then.
Right.
And I want to know who did this. And I think that's a huge, and even not just him, you look at Hobbs' wife, she's the same way.
Yep.
You look at all of these different parents that they want to know. And I think that I'm kind of disappointed in the police a little bit, I have to admit, because I think that they kind of get trapped into that situation where they're like, they believed it so much that, oh no, we can't admit our mistake. And I wish that they would. Man, that's what we're there for. Prosecutors are a little guilty of this too. I mean, you see it every time on these cases that are massive cases because they don't want to get sued. They don't want to look like they made a mistake. Hey, listen, here's the thing. We have to be correct. And if something comes up and it proves that these people are innocent, we need to get them out of there, you know?
Right.
And let's continue on. And unfortunately, I think in this particular case, you got the West Memphis Police that I would almost bank on it that they're not looking at anything at this point. This case is done.
Right.
In their minds, they did this offered plea, and that's it, which basically is them pleading guilty. And this case is done. And that's really one of the biggest miscarriages of justice as far as I'm concerned. My heart goes out to these West Memphis Three guys, all three of them. And you talk about, and I think that they've done relatively well to do something with their lives at this point. But can you imagine? I mean, 18 years of your life just being stripped from you.
I would be a bitter. I'm not. Listen. Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, specifically those two, more or less those two, you're better than me because I would be making a stink. I would be a bitter person. I
think Jason Baldwin wanted to. I mean, I think right now, if it was up to Jason Baldwin, he would have stayed in jail and went through the trial.
Right.
I really do believe that. And it's just what Damien Echols said at the offered plea. He goes, listen, I owe my life to this guy. And the reason why he's doing this is because I was on death row. And that's the only reason why he's doing this. Otherwise, he would have continued the fight. And I would love to talk to those two guys. I really would. I think it would be a fascinating discussion with them. I think that they would be, I would love to hear about their experience, really the off the record stuff, you know,
I plan to track
what that
them down.
was like for them.
I plan to track them. Oh, I plan to track them down for that reason, just for that. So I could hear from them the missing parts of the documentaries, because there's a lot missing, you know.
There is.
So real quick, let's go, Leslie. Terry Hobbs, that guy guilty in your eyes? Because he is in mine.
Well, I tend to kind of be persuaded by the slant of the documentary, I have to admit. And the clips that they showed of him, even after, like when Jason was talking and his wife found out about the death of their son, he went over behind the car, if I remember correctly, and he was smoking a cigarette, and he looked pretty nervous once those bodies were found.
I agree.
I thought he did have a reaction, but he looked like he was puffing pretty hard on that cigarette and very nervous in that moment. The video that they showed of him when he was playing the guitar, which I guess should have been like a comfortable moment, he just looked very uneasy to me. He had kind of a funny, smirky sort of laugh. He would smile at odd times when he was talking about something serious, about the murders. He just kind of laughed and smirked, and he didn't come across as a straightforward guy. So it made me suspicious of him. And of course, all the things about him not being where he said he was, and as they were finding out more and more, and that the police had never gone and spoken to him afterwards, which was really odd, that he wasn't interviewed at the time. So, yeah, he's definitely on the radar for me.
Sandy, what do you think?
Yes. So I believe he also was the last person seen with the three boys.
Yep.
I believe.
Yep.
And so, yeah, and I think he also had a violent history. So that's never a good mix. Violent history, where his whereabouts kind of has been kind of inconsistent. So that's not good. So he doesn't say have an alibi. Like, where were you at the time? And he was the last one actually seen with all of the three boys. So honestly, I would never rule anybody out. That is the one thing what I've seen in my life is that I don't put anything past anybody. And so you may seem like the most straight up, honest individual, and I have been fooled. And so I don't put my hand in the fire for nobody, because I really do think anyone's capable of anything. So I would never rule anybody out.
Yeah. On top of which, one thing I noticed with him in particular, and if you guys paid attention to that guitar scene in some of his other interviews, he did a lot of redirecting. He didn't get direct answers from him. He would redirect the content and shift it towards something else constantly. Or when certain dates and times are called into question, he would redirect to another individual or even another subject. He never gave eye contact. Big deal for me. When I see people redirecting, I feel like they're hiding something. Yeah, and just like Leslie said, when the news of the boys hit, he was smoking, he was in the back of the car, and his mind was racing. And I think what he did wrong, so he's an opportunist. We noticed about the guy, goes place to place, the behaviors he displays. He tries to sue the Dixie Chicks for defamation of character, right? Not realizing that by doing that, he goes under oath and opened himself up to a world of nonsense he wasn't prepared for. Later drops the suit clearly because he didn't want any more of the public attention, nor did he want the case steering in his direction. So in his eyes, if I drop this suit, I'm no longer under oath, and they can't question me any further about that topic. That is not revisited through the series either. They kind of, when it came to Terry Hobbs, they put the information out that was necessary, but they didn't revisit it. I don't know if they still look at him today or not. I would. I wouldn't let it go. I mean, I'm just one of those. I mean, I'd spoken to another detective off podcast. I do a lot of interviews, and his attitude is, I'd rather have the right information than a conviction, because he prides himself on being right, not worried about outcomes. He wants the real information. Now we fast forward. And what Jason said, the defense attorneys in the beginning did pretty well, and I agree. I think if you pay attention to the Eccles case, they created some reasonable doubt, undoubtedly. But unfortunately, you had a jury pool, and you had people that were committed to these boys. And later on, it's discovered that one of the jurors got himself to be the head juror, right? This guy, Kent, got himself in a position to be the jury foreman, was utilizing communications from the DA and I now find out also some other officers, those boys had no chance. So later on they say, well, the defense wasn't good enough. I think in the case of the other two boys, they created reasonable doubt. And the confession from Jesse Misskelley should never have been heard by that jury, yet they were very aware of it because of this gentleman, Kent. He put the information out there for everyone to know about, how they convicted the other kid. Kent Arnold, right? Yeah, Kent Arnold gets the information to the juror, tainting the jury pool. They didn't have a shot. They were guilty, period. There was no way they would. Even Damian Eccles, who was faced with the amount of shit he was under, was confident that because he didn't do anything, that they were going to disprove him.
Mm-hmm.
It was hard for me to watch it. I think the hardest part for me to watch out of all of it, because Damien, his demeanor is very confident moving forward, but, probably driven by insecurity. But when they had that kid, Jason, handcuffed and they were bringing him to the car, that was heartbreaking for me. I saw a little boy, confused, unsure what's going on. In his mind, he's innocent, so it's unclear why he's being arrested. That whole sequence broke my heart. Jesse in prison later on discussing the case. You could still, look, this is a grown man. He got his head tattooed, but you still see the little boy. You still see the little boy. He's not behaving or acting like a normal adult. He's trapped in that time of his life. Damien went through some horrible, horrible things in prison. Beatings, rape. He's better than me because I would be on the attack. There'd be lawsuits. I'm not sure if they can't sue because of the way they were released from prison, the agreement they came to where they're still guilty, but time served. It makes me wonder if are they going to offer that to perhaps like when the Making Murderer new one comes out. Did they offer the same thing to Steve Avery and Brendan Darcy? Just say you're guilty and time served because they know they're wrong in some case or another. I don't know.
That's certainly a possibility. But that right there, in my opinion, I think that drops any kind of litigation that's going to be able to happen at that point. And that's
right.
That's why Arkansas was so interested in that. And I really don't think that they would have won moving forward. Maybe with Miss Kelly, they would have had a heck of a lot better case. I mean, they're going to have a lot. They've got his own statement, but
right. But he completely recanted, and he was proven psychologically unfit for the case he was in. If you read there's an article where he was evaluated, and even today as an adult would require special care to prepare for a case. They're not even sure he would be able to make testimony because you have to be you have to have your faculties. Your full.
Well,
faculties.
what helps all three boys is the DNA that doesn't match them. I mean,
right.
Period. There's DNA evidence there. It's in the ligature. Just to be clear about that DNA, you could have a DNA sample that's 1 in 17 octillion something, and you're not going to get a DNA scientist that's going to say it's a match. It's not a match. It's basically consistent, or they're not going to say it's absolutely 100% a match. They just don't do that. They'll say, but in this case, we're talking about less than 1% of the population has the same DNA as Hobbs, and that's a very, there's a lot of people there's very few people that could be, and he is in that pool of people, in that area. So I don't know. I jumped in there. I shouldn't have, but
no,
you didn't ask me a specific question.
I'm glad I'm glad you did. Leslie, in your opinion, these guys are found guilty. They're released on the premise that they're guilty, but there's time served. Should there be some sort of compensation for them? I would think.
Oh, there should be, but with that plea, there isn't. I mean, it's I did a whole kind of research about the Alford plea, and I still don't exactly understand it, how you can maintain your presumptive innocence, but you're pleading guilty, and that somehow that allows everyone to plea bargain and then charge you with a lesser charge, and you get off for time served. I know it depends on state to state, and I was curious about the difference between no contest and this Alford plea, but it just seems like an oxymoron, doesn't it? To plead guilty, but say you're innocent, but somehow all it seems to be is a loophole for people to kind of maneuver around the decision and for there to be no compensation available to those young men that were in prison for those 18 years. They have no recourse. So that's what they gave up in order to get their freedom. And I don't know, that doesn't seem right to me, but yet they, the powers that be, as far as the prosecution, still think they had their men when they had the three of them in prison, and they're not going to reopen the case with the idea that the guilty ones are out there somewhere. It's just a strange, to me, it's just a strange legal maneuver. And I read that different states, not every state operates the same, and not all states have an Alford plea, and there's all kinds of restrictions. And maybe Jason wants to talk more about that. And I don't know if that matters to you, Adam, but I think it's sad. It just seems it's kind of a no-win. I mean, they're out, but like you said in the beginning of this broadcast, they're not going to get their 18 years back.
No, and there's.
Well, let me mention something real quick so I don't forget, because I have a tendency to forget, and it's brilliant, and I will lose it forever.
Yeah.
So one of the things really is that really, when I talk about our criminal justice system being a little bit jacked up to some extent. And I think this is important because in this case, in the Avery case, in many cases, in any of these cases really that's jacked up, a lot of these cases, here's one of the problems. The problem is all right, there's a problem, and then there's something that helped these kids out. So the problem is that the media gets in touch. They get to see what the affidavit states. So therefore, it's going to say in there in this affidavit that it's out in the media. They're going to report on it like crazy. And that's that Miss Kelly Jr. ended up confessing to this, and it actually implicates the two other kids. That's going to be on the news for everybody. And believe me, everybody in that everybody in several zip codes in that area code and area codes surrounding that are going to be interested in this case, because three kids, especially three little kids that are second graders, they're going to listen to that. This isn't some gangbanger that got killed somewhere that nobody cares about. This is going to be, other than his mother or people close to that guy, I'm talking about three little kids. Everybody's concerned. Everybody is watching. So therefore, that already ends up out there in the media. And then these silly leaks with the testicles on his shelf in his bedroom, and that's found. And somebody asked the chief deputy, how did this get out? And he's like, I don't know, but it doesn't matter because the damage is already done. There has to be something done to restrict some of this information. And I will tell you from my perspective, when dealing with witnesses, where they basically blast them in these affidavits, or it ends up floating out to the defendant sometimes, and all these people that we try to protect, it contaminates everything. So even if, and I know that one juror, that's how that one juror knew about all this stuff, is because he heard about it on the news. That's why he wanted to be on that jury. Yep. That's why he insisted that's why he ended up sharing that. And that's why it was crossed out on their notes in the deliberation room. Okay. I think personally, my thing to correct some of this, if people really want to correct what the problems are in the criminal justice system, it's not defunding it. It's looking at certain things specifically. And one of the things, and I'm just a slick sleeve, bottom of the totem pole guy here, right? But in my opinion, is you gotta limit this information that ends up just contaminating everything. Does the general public really need to know the details down to the minute trace evidence in a case? No, they don't. They don't need to know all that stuff. That is for 12 jurors to hear what happens inside of a courtroom. Okay. That's who needs to hear this. And unfortunately, I mean, try to find somebody that doesn't know about this particular case going into that thing. They've already got a preconceived notion that these people are guilty. You talk about a burden to overcome. That's a massive burden. And in reality, the defense doesn't have a burden to prove that they're innocent. That all rests on the state. But in reality, that's not really the way it works. I mean, I'm just being real here. That's, Sandy, you work with these guys that are in prison all the time. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You see it all the time. And I'm not saying everybody that's in prison is innocent guilty. So, or innocent for that matter. But that's one of the things that I at least wanted to make a point of, is that we got to say that, because I think that's a huge reason. And then you take it on the other side of the coin. Well, if they hadn't let HBO in there to basically do a documentary on this, Damien Echols would be dead.
Yeah.
Period. 100%. And those other two boys would end up living the rest of their remainder of their life in prison. So there's kind of like, there has to be something on the scales. The scales are supposed to be even. and they're really not. And unfortunately, and then to add to something else, just real quick, they're kids, right? We don't have to have a parent in Oklahoma. I don't know what the laws are in every other place, but we don't have to have a parent present if it's a murder and if they're 14 or above. That's just the way the law is. And I'll tell you right now, if an attorney goes into those rooms, we're not even going to hear a story. We're never going to hear anything. So,
right.
I don't know what the fix is on that stuff. But I think that we as detectives have a responsibility to make sure that everything is done right. Okay. It's not worth solving a case to put somebody in prison forever. And I wouldn't be able to sleep at night, really, if I had been one of those detectives on this case. Because if I didn't, all this evidence coming forward and stuff like that, which there was a massive amount of evidence that's clearly showing their innocence. And then yet you have a judge. I think it was pretty what's the word? Reprehensible.
Yeah.
That this judge said, I'm not going to hear any more evidence ever. It's over. How could you possibly make a statement like that? That's about one of the most irresponsible things I've ever heard.
I'm glad you said that.
I think really in part, I think that the judges on the Arkansas Supreme Court are kind of heroes. I was super, super impressed by what we saw on that documentary and their questions, which actually applied common sense, and which was pretty interesting that they actually ruled the way they did, because that is such an uphill battle for anybody that is incarcerated. It really is. To be able to prove your innocence once you're convicted, good luck. Okay. Super, super, super rare. Fortunately, and if you notice the attorney that was on behalf of Damian Eccles, he's the same attorney for Brendan Dassey. Actually. Yeah. So they're super, super sharp people. And I thought that the prosecutor from the state that was represented in the Arkansas State of Appeals, that guy was a joke. So it sounded terrible argument, et cetera, because he didn't have an argument. I mean, what do you mean we're not going to listen to new evidence when it possibly could show these guys innocent? Yeah, we don't want to open up the door.
He went into a gunfight with no ammunition. You know what I mean? And then that's a good point too. If you're a judge, right, your job is to oversee the freedoms or non-freedoms of other people. You should want to hear all the evidence, new or otherwise. That's a huge blemish. And the other thing, like this juror, Kent Arnold, I don't hear about any reprisal for this. It's documented in the documentary that he definitely tainted the jury pool. It's known by state and local law enforcement. Where's the reprisal for this guy?
This judge went to jail.
Yeah,
I don't know what the charge is. I really don't. But there should have been some kind of consequence for that to prevent that from happening by other people.
Right. I
don't know what the charge is, but there's got to be something there.
And if not, they should invent something. But I'm sure there is. Like I did, the judge David Burnett, his behavior is 17th century. I hate to say that about this guy. You're a judge in a superior court. I don't know what he is today, but you're there. You're paid to make sure that justice is served, that those scales are balanced. And for him to say, I swear, if you listen on the documentary and other interviews he does, his mind is made up. That's not a fair jurist. That's not being an impartial jurist. If you made your mind up and you're not willing to learn new things or evolve the way you think, you shouldn't be in that position, period. He should have some reprisal as well. Maybe they can't, these three boys can't get any compensation for their arrest, but I think in a civil suit, maybe go after this juror that tainted the jury pool to secure your arrest for 18 years. That guy should be held accountable, 100%.
Well, and it actually adds to my a little tiny extra point I want to throw in there. And this is, listen, I'm a homicide detective, and I'm finding the truth, and I'm looking for people that did bad things, and I want them to go to prison or whatever needs to happen. All right. So I'm not out hugging trees throughout the country. Right. Trust me on that one. But I'm going to say this. One of the things that I will make note of is that it's really kind of an unfair system to an extent when you're talking about when certain defendants just don't have the financial means, or their legal team does not have the financial means to hire experts that really can bring more light to a case. I'm not talking about testifying just because they're getting paid X amount of money to be the defense experts and they're going to say whatever is going to get a paycheck for them. I'm talking about really dissecting cases and coming together. But this is never going to happen, Adam. I mean, It's just never going to happen in our world. But in reality, if they just came together to find out what the truth is, to do the right thing. I mean, that's really how simple this should be.
It's true, because the guys at the end of the series that they formed like this team of experts, a dream team, if you would, that wasn't free. Thanks to HBO and some of these people that were supportive of these men, they've raised the money by any means necessary to allow them to have these experts, to get them free.
Yeah, I mean, clearly you can tell by the families of those three boys. I mean, they didn't have a nickel between the three of them.
No.
I mean, we're talking super poor.
And
there's no way.
And that should frighten everyone, from Capitol Hill down to the poor people. In order to have a fair, balanced court proceeding with a judge who's really impartial, to have a good jury, there's a couple things that need to happen. One, it's not just appoint them, wet behind the ears attorney who's just making his mark so he could climb the ladder to become a better attorney. Especially in cases like this, find someone. Find a pro bono attorney that wants to make a mark, that's already has their name up there. And then the other big thing is get media under control. The shit that they spread around, these boys and a lot of other cases I've been reading about have no shot at all. It's over.
No.
Before you get to the courtroom, you're guilty. And people like Nancy Grace back in her heyday, Jane Velez, who made their ratings on basically crucifying people. We've seen this in Scott Peterson. We've seen it in the Steve Avery case. Every case that makes it to that level, there's no chance that there's a non-biased jury getting in that box. They're already very educated in what the media wants to understand. It
starts with the police department. I mean, the police department is the first stage in this, and they have a responsibility to do a thorough investigation. Period.
Right.
They need to do follow up. They need to continue their investigation long after that. And when other things come up, then they need to explore things, and they really need to spare no expense to do that. I'm very fortunate where I work. I mean, if there's something that needs to be done, I mean, we're allowed to do it, and our city wants us to do it. So that's good. I think that in West Memphis, I just don't know that it's, first of all, they were way over their head, like I said earlier, and they just didn't have the level of expertise or just the level of anything. This is way beyond anything I'm surprised. I seriously am surprised. And I don't know. I mean, I know that the FBI has a way to kind of get involved in investigations when there's a ransom and stuff like that, like JonBenet Ramsey. They didn't really get involved in that case either from the early stages. But I'm really surprised that in this particular case that the Arkansas State Police, just like the governor, didn't demand that, or basically just order them to be over there and taking part in this investigation. If that rule can't be made, then, I know that on a department of Tulsa and our size that, we handle our own investigations. We don't need Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation to come in and take a case over. We have our own lab. We have very seasoned investigators that are probably far more seasoned than a lot of people working for the state.
Yeah, I mean,
but in this case,
the burden of proof is on the state, right? And
yes.
that being said, when the state is throwing their hands up and very clearly, look, this is before social media. This day and age, a change in venue is worthless because of social media. You're not hiding. No matter if you decide to take your case to Honolulu, they're going to know about you in this day and age. Mm-hmm. Back in the day, maybe a change of venue, maybe if you're not high profile, but when it comes to the point when there's investigators working a case, there's three boys dead. They're arresting these other guys. People are screaming to the top of their lungs, these guys are innocent. HBO's involved, and HBO's calling into question the abilities of the state to investigate this case. And then on top of which, later on you discover one of the jurors planted himself there for the sole purpose of making sure these guys go to jail. There must be intervention. There has to be. It's not good enough. This is America. We're supposed to, be innocent until proven otherwise. And we're not seeing that in these lot of cases. Sandy, let me ask you, you work in the prison system. More often than not, you're hearing from inmates, they're innocent. It's tough for you because do you believe them or don't? You know what I mean? How many are actually innocent? What is your intake? What do you think of that?
So I have learned a lot about the judicial system, and sadly, I don't have a lot of faith in it. I have had it's weird, meaning I've had a couple death row inmates actually. One had done, I think, 18 years, and he was set free. And for those 18 years, of course, everybody saw him as being guilty. DNA set him free. And of course, the state ended up having to compensate. I forget how much it is per day for as long as he was in prison. I had another inmate that he had done 21 years, and he had gone to court, and they did the DNA, and it wasn't his DNA. But it was kind of crazy because he had to wait almost an entire other year in prison before the judge would hear the case again and make a ruling and actually let him go. So for the entire year, I had to sit there and speak with him, and he was frustrated. Like, I'm innocent and I still can't leave. And I kind of started off in corrections, like kind of being an idealist, and now I'm like a realist.
Right.
In the sense of like, I have learned that depending on the judge and depending on who it is, other judges will not overturn anything. And it's, unfortunately, it's corrupt. Meaning whether it's the media doing it, people, the police, whatever, there is a level of corruption that has infiltrated into our system. I do agree that oversharing too much information and the media getting in anybody's head and already, they already have contaminated people's mindsets, their opinions and everything. And even if you don't want to realize it, but that's where the whole bias comes in too. And whether people realize it or not, they're already engaged in it. Like with these kids, it's like, oh yes, they were metal band. Oh, you're weird. They were the exception, not part of the mainstream, right? And so because you're weird, that means you're guilty. So it's like anybody who's different, that's got to be the guilty party. And that's how they get portrayed. And we see how many times media really plays into people's opinions and perceptions on this. And the perception, even it may be in perception, but guess what? It's their reality.
Right.
So you can't sit there and completely disregard people's perceptions because that is a reality that they're functioning under. And like I said, it's been really interesting because I've seen people walk out absolutely innocent and spend many years in prison. And unfortunately, kind of like Damien, at a very high cost, emotionally, psychologically, physically, all of it. And in this case, it makes me mad because I just feel like that judge was done. He didn't want to hear about it. I think he just wanted to make it go away. So here, let's try to, make everybody happy. You want out of prison? Great, under these terms. So that way the case shuts and it goes away. Let's sweep it under the rug. And I think if that's the type of judgment you're going to use, I should look him up. I hope he's no longer a judge.
I got to tell you, his behavior, his verbiage, his body language, how did he become a judge in the first place?
He seemed annoyed with it.
Right.
And for me, and that's what I'm saying, is like, you're already coming in with some sort of mindset and everything. And I'm like, you need to be impartial. And if you cannot do that, then that's not where you belong.
Right. I mean, he didn't demonstrate any kind of legal mindedness at all. It was almost like the guy at school who heard a rumor and accepted the rumor at its face value. It's disgusting. And Overmore, and it makes
he did not care about carrying out the justice and making sure that it really was protecting everything. He didn't. I just feel like it was like a check mark. Done. I'm over it.
We've seen something similar in the Scott Peterson case where there was a female who got on the jury specifically to make sure he was not going to go free. In this case, this guy, Kent Arnold, same thing. At the very minimum, we should be crucifying these people on media. They should be getting charges, undoubtedly. They should not go free. You tainted the jury pool. You brought in information that they should not have been privy to secure a conviction. You should be absolutely crucified for that. It's terrible. When I hear Damien Echols' story and what happened to him in prison, it destroys me inside. My heart breaks for him. It's terrible. And he endured it. And then you hear him say things like, Damien Echols, he met his wife. He's grateful for the life he has. I mean, that's an amazing thing to say, considering what you've been through. I remember being a kid in that era. I'm younger than those guys, but I wore a Megadeth shirt, and I lived in Florida in a pretty populated area. And I remember the people, I'll never forget, it was a neighbor of mine down the road. His name was Ron. I don't know if he's alive or not. He worked for the Postal Service, and he looked at me one day because I was friends with his son, Pete. And he's like, well, what are you wearing that shirt for? And what are you going to do with the rest of your life? I'm 14, or 12 at the time, actually. I'm 12. I'm wearing this shirt. I like the band. And because I'm wearing this, my life's in jeopardy. My future's in question. That is just a narrow-minded perspective that people hold. And then that's just where I live. Now imagine you're in this small town in the Bible Belt. Forget it. No wonder the cops hyper-focus on these guys. They're Satan's occupants, undoubtedly. So, I don't know.
Well, imagine for a moment if the cops had just did some canvas over there where Hobbs lived.
Yes.
I mean, literally, I'm kind of frustrated at that young lady for not calling the cops really right after that had happened, because you'd be surprised at how many witnesses said, well, I was waiting for you to show up. And it's like, why didn't you call? And if they had done that, that would have changed possibly the entire dynamic of this entire case. If the cops had even started going down that road and started seeing, hey, wait a second, he was seen following those kids going that direction, and he's the last person to see him. And that, in addition to that, because he denies that still to this day that he ever saw those kids.
Right.
That's a huge deal.
That's a really big deal.
And had that happen, golly, it's really hard to it's hard to do these cases when they happen, number one. But try to go back many years later and try to reconstruct things, or try to go back however many years this was now. We're talking 30 years ago.
Well, Jason, put this in your head.
Impossible.
Put this in your head. That this crime happens in 93. Now, this witness, or these witnesses, plural, there were others that came forward and said they saw this guy, Hobbs, with those kids just prior. Not just her. She's the one that got to actually agree to come on camera, right? Mm-hmm. Now, 1993, this crime happens. 1996, the first documentary comes out. It is let me I guess phrase this correctly. It's HBO. It was probably expensive for them in that area, I'm going to assume, but that it's sensationalized at that time. It's
the talk of the town,
right?
Everybody's talking about it.
So this woman and these witnesses, when that documentary come out, should be like, wait a minute, Terry Hobbs is 100% with these kids in and around that time frame, in and around that area. Why not step forward there? It's not till the third installment in 2001, where the woman was either interviewed then or prior to, but she comes forward and says, well, they never came to speak to me. You said it right. They never came to speak to her, but she should have spoke up. She should have said something.
Well, shoulda, woulda, coulda. And that's people. That's people for you. If it does, and I'm not saying that I'm not saying that she's one of those type of people that was like, hey, don't put my name up in this, or I'm not going to get involved kind of deal. I don't think she had any feelings like that. I just think that she moved on with her life and did her thing and concerned about whatever she's doing, etc. I just think that that's really unfortunate that she didn't, because, it's not just that, but then you can start going after the alibis and attacking the alibis, etc., etc. John Douglas, I thought it was interesting when he said, and he's the profiler from the FBI, etc., that said that how, what he thinks at this point, that it was somebody close to him, that, whatever, that somebody that knew him, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But that the person that did this, in his opinion, would be able to pass the polygraph. Well, I'd still like to see him take one. I think it'd be interesting, and why not? I'd like to know what his reaction would be as to whether or not he would take it anyway.
I mean, we have new technology now where they hook your brain up to something and they can see the brain activity.
I've seen that. Well, yeah, with Stephen Avery.
Yeah.
So,
I'm dumbfounded. I'm dumbfounded by this. I really am. Like the Terry.
Well, in reality, you don't know what DNA evidence. I'll just tell you the advances with DNA. Just to give you an idea, I just learned of this just the other day, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. But they're coming out with, it's mandated that by 2027 we're going to have like handheld scanners that you could literally scrape up a blood stain, stick it in this machine, and it'll give you the DNA. And you can compare that almost immediately with somebody based on their swab. That's how quick DNA is coming about.
I mean,
you don't have to wait for months. You're not waiting weeks. You're getting an instant right now, if that's that guy's blood at the scene, kind of a deal. And I'm talking about like a blood trail at a murder scene that you think that this is the suspect.
That's a huge game changer.
It really is.
Well, I mean, imagine this.
That's the advances.
Yeah. There's a guy who's working on something right now. I watch a lot of documentaries. I don't watch regular TV like regular people. I watch documentaries, science stuff, space stuff, obviously murder mysteries. And this guy is telling me by 2035, they're going to have the ability to 100% hook you up to something and know what you've, like, they could recap everything you've done for, I believe it's like a 10-day period there prior. When you hear this, there's a movie that came out some years ago called Deja Vu. You ever seen that movie with Denzel Washington? You should watch that movie. Great movie. They can rewind time and see everything to all the various cameras and replace what happened there. I mean, we've seen many, many of times where science imitates art. I said this with Steve Murr on a podcast just recently. Like when Star Wars came out, Luke's planet had two sun setting because they were orbiting a binary star. Well, that was science fiction. Well, today we now know that there's more binary stars with planetary systems involved than there are singular. So if it ever comes to the case where we could do something like a deja vu, that would be wonderful. It would really minimize the horse shit, because these guys got the ringer. They got destroyed. And Terry Hobbs, in my opinion, should be really very deeply looked into. This guy, Kent Arnold, I would like to hear some kind of reprisal for this guy. And this judge, Burnett, really needs to be called into question as a fair jurist, because he's not. He's not impartial by any means. He seemed frustrated when questioned. He seemed irritated when it had to come back to light. And like Jason said, thank God for the Supreme Court, because, all these factors uninvolved. Here's another thing too. You got Netflix, Prime, HBO, all these organizations. When there's someone that's in prison and they're screaming innocence, maybe have someone evaluate them. If you see if there's anything to it, make a documentary. I mean, if that's what it takes, make a documentary film about it. Something's got to give, because in my mind, these three boys represent a larger body of people incarcerated right now, and that troubles me, makes me nervous. There's not a lot of Jason Whites out there. You know what I mean? There's not a lot of them out there.
Well, I really think there's more than you think. I think that most, I don't know of any homicide detectives that are out there trying to just get a case solved by sticking just whoever in there. But you gotta, you have to really stand your ground on some of these cases too, because I've worked for people that, the pressure is there. That they're like, well, you have plenty to make an arrest, and I'm more erring on the side of caution I want to be 100% sure that this person did it as opposed to 97% sure, because I've seen crazy things and things aren't always what they appear. And I want to make sure that we make the right decision here. And I think that the families, they can be a lot of pressure too, but I think that at the end of the day, they appreciate that. And that's what we want. We want people that did the crime, and we want them to get the just punishment. And sometimes the just punishment isn't locking them up and throwing away the key forever. Sometimes it's 10 years. Sometimes it's 20 years. Sometimes it's a different deal. So, but we want to, and sometimes it's not going to prison at all,
Right.
But we want people to, we have to do our best, and we need to do our due diligence. We as the police, and I'm not just talking in homicide, I'm talking in every discipline within policing, that we have a job to do. And that's why the people, there used to be a lot more trust in what we do, and hopefully that trust will continue to build again. But we have a tendency to continue to step on ourselves and do something stupid somewhere in this country, which diminishes the trust that we've built and we've worked very hard to get. So, it takes a lot of dedication and let's just hope that we get to a better place in our world, and we don't have to. Stuff is still going to happen. I mean, it's not going to end here. There's going to be another case just like this down the line, and that's because you have human beings involved in this process, and humans are not perfect. But well,
what it's really going to take is officers like you to set the bar, to set the example, to something to model after. Because all too often, I've seen a lot of these videos where there's cops that are corrupt, and like one woman here in Pinellas County she was driving drunk. She tried utilizing her badge. They arrested her anyway. Right thing to do. She's drunk. But that's, with the body cameras now, I've heard another bunch of cases where they're arresting the lieutenant, but he's drunk, eradicated drunk, but they have the body camera. And you hear him expressing, oh, we have the camera on, where there's the idea there might be some special treatment involved.
Well, that's really fallen by the wayside with body cameras. That's not even, it's not even the same world. I mean, that just, you can't really do that much anymore. So,
right. And it keeps,
and that's a good thing. I mean,
it's a great thing. Keeps everyone accountable.
That's a good thing.
You need
that's
accountability.
Right.
Yeah. 100%.
Right.
So before we close out, let's do this. Start with Leslie. Who's your guilty party and why so?
Can I just comment to something that's been said a few minutes ago? I think as far as the justice system as a whole, I think Jason has some really good points. And I think when you were talking about the woman who didn't call the police and make sure that the information about seeing Terry Hobbs, that they had that, there's so many little holes along the way that derailed what could have been, things that weren't done or things that weren't investigated or conclusions that were jumped to, that it was these three guys and not to look seriously at other people over here. All those things kind of feed into the conclusion and the outcome. And I think Jason's talking about improving investigations and improving the law enforcement end of things. I know we're talking about these two cases, one, the Avery case, and also this case, about trying to get a retrial or get a case looked at, and how difficult it is going before the state Supreme Court and trying to get somebody to listen to you. But I suspect, just from what I've heard, that most everybody that's in prison says they're not guilty. Okay, so if you start for every person who says they're not guilty, you have HBO come in and do a documentary. That's kind of foolish. Instead of trying to find them on the other side, and I think there needs to be safeguards so that not every case is reopened, because then how that would bog down the court system. I think for those extreme cases where you can see that there's legitimate cause to relook at a case, there should be a means to do that, but it shouldn't be an easy thing to do, because just think how tied up all the courts would be if they're retrying and retrying. So I think to deal with the problem in the first place is to make sure that all your ducks are in a row as far as law enforcement, that the case is a good one, rather than trying to come in the back end and say, wait a minute, we jumped to conclusions and now we're trying to get another trial.
I'm speaking more in terms of like HBO or any of these networks, to at least vet the case long before they agree to a filming. You know, I mean, you're talking about companies with big, deep pockets that when they want to go out and make something, there should be a vetting process, right? It's not just, he says he's innocent, let's go film it. They would have to vet it, and they'd have to go, you know, and really take this case for example. If we're hearing about it without it being sensationalized already, and we read some of the reports and we hear the conflicting stories, maybe has some validity to it, and we look into this. But not all of them are going to get it. But I know what you mean, though.
Well, and I know what you mean, too. You weren't being cavalier. I kind of went to the far extreme and said everybody who says they're innocent. I'm just saying there are a lot of things to be fixed, for sure. And we go over those when we talk about them. So who do I think? Was that your question?
Yeah, who's your suspect?
I think Terry Hobbs needs to be looked at seriously.
I agree. What about you, Sandy? Who's your suspect?
Unfortunately, the unknown person, Emma Jangles, and Terry Hobbs, definitely. I just find this case pretty sad. You know, these 8-year-old boys murdered, and honestly, somebody got away with it.
Yep. And
the police are not actively doing anything about it because the case is pretty much solved, you know, because they had 3 boys and they pled guilty just to kind of get out of a really poor situation that they shouldn't have been in there to begin with. But the system, again, failed them. And, you know, I know it's perfect, so a perfect system I know will never exist. But it would be nice that if, for once, the system, when it sees that, hey, we messed up, owned it, and actually actively went to fix it instead of trying to cover itself up, you know, from, you know, being on display, you know what I mean, or highly criticized, or too much, you know, being in that limelight and they don't want it. But I really wish that, you know, when those mistakes are done, that it's like, you know what? Our bad. We messed up. Right. We apologized. We should have said, honestly, those boys should have set free. They should have never been put in a place where they had to plead guilty. And there should have been consequences to really damaging the first trial with, you know, the juror kind of embedded in there and really, you know, messing things up. And then, you know, yet none of that came to be. There was never anybody saying, you know what, and then let's really find who did it. You know?
That would be the concern.
Really, the murder got away with it. But that's because the system allowed it.
I agree. You know, that's what we saw was the state not take ownership of fault. They just acknowledged it with this deal they made. So why are they not actively looking for the real killer? It's because they got a guilty. They got a guilty plea. And these, in the eyes of the state, the burden is not really on them anymore to find it. I mean, the truth is, it's a travesty. These 3 young boys were, at the end of the day, murdered. Their killer is still free, whether he be alive or dead. The real tragedy is that their death. And again, it wasn't the state taking ownership of a fault. They were just acknowledging it with this little deal. And that's a real tragedy. Jason, who? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sandy.
No, I agree. And for the families, imagine their sons, for those mothers, their sons. And it's not like they were, and I'm not saying being murdered is horrible, but like the manner in which they were is horrific, because they endured things prior to actually their death. And it's kind of like, well, there's nothing being done about it. And so I agree. I just think it's horrible all around.
Yeah, it is a tragedy, especially for those young boys. I mean, Jason, who do you have as a suspect? Why?
Well, the parents are basically should be jumping up and down. These three boys were exonerated, as far as I'm concerned. So they deserve justice, and somebody should be out there looking to try to figure out what's up and continuing on. As far as suspects go, I think that Terry Hobbs is definitely somebody that's high up on the list. You can't exclude that Mr. Bojangles individual, especially with the hair that they found on a sheet over there, and just the description. Those people that were at the Bojangles, they don't know the circumstances of these boys getting killed over there. They don't know that it's over in water and there's going to be mud, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So I think that's pretty compelling. That's super interesting to me. And then there's actually a couple of other young men that we never mentioned, and I don't know their name off the top of my head, but they're two young men that actually their name came up in this investigation as well, and they ended up fleeing to California. I say fleeing. They took off to California 4 days after the murders, and they actually were tracked down by California authorities, and they were actually interviewed by California authorities. They actually polygraphed both of them, and they both failed the polygraph in reference to this homicide. And actually, one of them actually said, "Okay, I did it." And then all of a sudden he recanted it. So those two individuals that came up on an article that I was reading. So you have four people right there. I think it's a great start. And I think that there's no reason in the world why you couldn't at least make an effort to try to go give Mr. Hobbs a visit and talk to him and see if he's willing to talk to you, and then go from there. If the guy's innocent, do a polygraph. Maybe he'll be willing to do that. I don't know what the answer. I would think that he's pretty gun shy at this point to say anything about this case. But that's what I think. I think that's four really good, solid people to work with, and hopefully they'll look into this in the future. I don't know. But I guarantee you those boys that the West Memphis Three have probably made more efforts than a lot of other people, probably more so than O.J. Simpson, actually.
Yeah.
As far as the search for the real killers. Yeah. So, I don't know. But
none of them has made a book says, if I did do it.
Right. And I'll tell you, Will, listen, my heart goes out to those three young men, and I really think that this whole case is their identity now anyway. And I think that there actually has been, I know that's crazy to think this, but I think that there's been a tremendous amount of positive that has come their way in life that would have never, I can't imagine what they went through, but if there was a silver lining out of any of this, those boys have, at least, a couple of them for that matter, I think have really made positive strides in their life that probably wouldn't have ever been available to them had this not occurred. But not. Does that make sense? I'm not saying this was a good thing.
It makes sense. I mean, I guess the better way to put it is, look, it's better they had a silver lining towards the end than nothing at all. I mean,
agreed.
As far as their lives moving forward without this conviction, question mark. We don't know.
But there's still people out there that still think that they did it. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. That's just that's a human nature thing. But I think if you applied any kind of common sense to this at all, it's just not possible. That's what you have to look at, is what is reasonable and what makes sense. And sometimes the truth is right there staring you right there in the face. And that's why Mr. Hobbs looks like a great contender, and that's why the other stepdad looked great for a while. It's just that Mr. Hobbs can't be excluded based on what they have. So you never know what the next few years might hold. I mean, that DNA that they were able to get, they might be able to do some stuff with that and really build upon that chain of DNA, and it might be able to tell you a little bit more of a definitive answer as to who's involved. I don't know. I mean, but I think this has been, first of all, to the group, I'm glad you actually watched the documentary, and I hope that you were on the edge of your seat when you watched it, because I think it's a fascinating documentary. I really do, and it really gives you so much, and it's I'm surprised they were able to get out as quick as they were, if truth be known, especially in the 90s. I'm surprised they didn't have to sit in there for many more years of argument and maybe going up into the federal system, et cetera. And God only knows where it would have went from there. So,
yeah.
But anyway,
I mean,
what about you, Adam? What do you think?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the other two guys. I did look into that, but there was really nothing there other than that they drug tested him, found him high on numerous amounts of narcotics. Polygraphs, we don't know. And the confession, we don't know if they got browbeaten. There's so little to learn about them. For me personally, Terry Hobbs here's what happened with me, Jason. I watched a documentary, the first one, and then I rewatched it. Because the first time I absorb information, I fact check as I go. The second time, I watch everyone's eye movements, their body language, the way they speak. So I actually watched 6 hours of the first one. I rewatched the third installment a couple of times on certain parts. So in conclusion, I think Terry Hobbs, if not directly, is somewhat involved. Has to be. He definitely knows more than what he's letting on to. He should be looked at a little more closely. As far as Mr. Bojangles, God, he just the mud, the blood, the timing, really. And now, the DNA I'm surprised they didn't track this guy down and really browbeat him. But it just never came to fruition. So as it stands right now, I feel strongly about Terry Hobbs. The Mr. Bojangles guy is a question mark for me. The other two boys, so little known about them. No idea where they are today, in fact. I'm going to dig deeper to look into that. But again, at the end of the day, this is really more about three little boys whose lives were taken far too early, and we should be doing more to find out everything surrounding that. That's the goal.
And finally, and I'll tell you one thing real quick. It's actually a good thing that nobody is in jail right now.
Yeah,
with this many questions, I mean, you got to have something more definitive to be able to put somebody in prison and lock them up forever.
Yeah.
Because
if I'm sitting on the jury, there's not enough there to convict whatsoever.
No, not in this case.
And I'll give a shout out. He's not with us anymore. He passed away in 2022. But Mark Byers. If anyone, I don't think he has family that would listen. But I mean, the guy was crazy, man. But he became a champion to these three innocent men in the end of it all, which I'll give him credit, because the way he behaved in the beginning and burning hell and setting fires, and he was adamant on it. The minute he found any kind of evidence not really linking him, he didn't about face. He evolved with his train of thought. He changed who he was. He formed stronger opinions. And even after that series was over, that documentary was done, for many years after that last documentary, he was fighting hard to find facts. And that gives, a lot of credit due to him for that. I was unaware of that. He fought hard for years. He did not let that case die. He wanted to find who the killers were, period. Not saying he's perfect. That guy's freaking weird. A lot of weird things happen around him, but credit is due where credit is due. So for those of you that are listening, we're going to say good night, good day, good evening, or whatever it is for you, and I'm going to talk to my team in post.